In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I had a great conversation on location in Mexico City with architect and city planner Pablo Lazo. I recorded this while I was away on my Churchill Fellowship visiting Mexico in March, and I really enjoyed this conversation and I really enjoyed my visit to Mexico. If you want to hear my reflections on my visit to Mexico City, as well as some of the other places I visited while I was away, you should subscribe to the exclusive podcast about my Churchill Fellowship. It's available exclusively for supporters on Pozible. So head to pozible.com today and search for My Smart Community. Then you can hit support. There are several episodes there already for you to get stuck into and hear about the various people, places, and platforms I investigated as part of my fellowship. In this episode, Pablo and I discuss his passion for cities and his interest in smart mobility. We really focus in on Mexico City and the opportunities and challenges the city is currently facing in terms of transport, urban sprawl, population, and employment opportunities. We talk about the relationship between place, mobility, and public health, and how we can use data to better understand this relationship and provide better solutions for our communities. Pablo and I also discuss smart streets and how we need to be more proactive about reducing conflict between different users on our roads, plus the emerging trends of both autonomous vehicles and walkability. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Pablo. How are you today?
I'm very well, Zoe, and you?
I am fantastic. I can't believe I'm sitting here in Mexico City. So, doesn't get much better than that, right?
It can be better, even on a Friday afternoon.
Well, let's jump straight in, and can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Sure. Well, I was trained as an architect here in Mexico City many years ago. And then I went and did a master's in urban planning in London. So I have always been passionate about cities and the built environment from different angles, smaller scale issues such as architecture, but also large scale issues related to urbanism in general and aspects that are now common ground for urbanism, such as mobility, transportation, ecology, sustainability, and urban resilience.
Excellent. So what sparked your interest in smart mobility?
Well, I think smart mobility has come up to me through my previous work as associate principal at Arab for a few years in different continents, and attracted because I always thought that the way cities operate, approximately 1/3 of the operation of cities are related to how people move in the cities. Understanding what are the challenges, what are the options, what are the resources, what are the technologies that people have to move around in cities, it is critical for cities to perform better in the future.
So let's talk about Mexico City and what are some of the biggest challenges that we're facing?
Wow, huge question. Mexico City is probably one of the biggest cities in the world that faces challenges related to urban mobility in ways that no other city has the problems. And I'm saying that because on the one hand, it is a city that, because its geography and topography, it is surrounded by mountains and areas that are completely inaccessible for transportation options, as it were. And on the other hand, it's because the demographics of the city in terms of how the options of where people work and where people live have always made this kind of dichotomy of people living in the suburbs or in the periphery and coming to work to the central area. And that has created a huge problem of daily trips in and out of the city that have evolved in a huge congestion problem for the whole city. And the other aspect is related to the options that people have in the city to move around. Approximately 60% of the daily trips are made by public transport. And from those 60%, another 60% are made by what it's normally called here as a pecero, which is a small bus. It's not a big public bus. It's a smaller version, but it's completely unregulated. Their routes and their schedules are very arbitrary. And the service, as you could imagine, is very, very poor. So on the one hand, it's one thing that this city needs to move around people. But on the other hand, the problem lies exactly on that aspect of the system.
And can you talk a little bit about Mexico City being a group of, well, it was like villages, and now the growth has just kind of swallowed these villages, and how each place kind of has its own characteristics?
Yeah, the urban expansion of Mexico City that occurred over the last century or so grew from the downtown area, the area that was founded by the Spaniards in the 1500s, and since then. And throughout the expansion of the city, as you said, it swallows some villages that used to be peripheral to the central downtown area of the Spaniards 500 years ago. So you have areas like Tlalpan, Coyoacán, and San Angel that used to be villages like 60, 70 years ago to the south of the city, or areas in the western part of the city, such as Capozalco, that was another village. And now they are completely swallowed in this huge urban area that is called Mexico City. And on top of that, you have all the surrounding metropolitan area that it's a huge area. It's approximately 80 square kilometers, give or take. And that operates as a single urban entity, although in services such as public transportation, it is very segregated and makes it very, very difficult.
And can you talk a little bit about how many people are in the central kind of downtown area? Maybe their address is there, and then how much that population grows like during the workday?
Yeah, that's a very interesting figure, actually, Zoe. You have 8 million people, give or take, living in Mexico City, according to the last census. And you have 8 more million people coming in and out from the metropolitan area and working in Mexico City on a daily basis. So roughly speaking, you have 8 million daily trips in and out.
So you kind of
duplicate the population on the city on a daily basis.
And can you talk a little bit about the public transport, what options are available right now?
Well, the city has, since the late 1960s or so, began the development and implementation of public transport alternatives, such as the metro, light rail, public buses. And since 1960s, more or less, it has gradually increased the offer of those services. But the increase of the offer of those services has not been at the same pace of the increase of the demand for public transportation. So even though for Latin America cities, in comparison, Mexico City has probably the biggest metro system in terms of total kilometers covered, and the amount of daily trips is substantial, is not enough for the amount of people that need to move around in Mexico and that would use metro as an option. In recent years, there has been additions such as telefericos, cable bus, the
like cable car?
Cable car, exactly. Mostly in the state of Mexico, but the new government is going to implement 2 new projects in the south and in the eastern part of Mexico City to bring that as another alternative. Also, the BRT system has grew substantially over the last 10 years, coming from 1 line to 10 years ago to 6 to 8 lines in this year.
So that's the bus rapid transit
system, or dedicated bus routes.
Metro bus?
Metro bus, yes.
Yeah, I took it last night and this morning.
Right.
It was good.
And it's good. It's a good, reliable service.
Yeah.
It keeps the schedule. It has, their daily trips. The length of the trips in terms of time is more or less constant. So it's a huge step forward. But also very important is that most of the public transport offers here are subsidized. So they're very, very cheap.
Yeah.
And that is why a lot of people use it, because it costs 5 pesos the single trip in metro, 2.5 pesos the single trip in Metrobus, and so on. So it receives a lot of subsidies, and that's probably another reason why it's used the way it's used in terms of total customers, as it were. And recently you have other modes of mobility, such as the scooters, the public bike programs, and so on.
What do you think the most important thing is when we're talking about smart mobility? You know, we talked about this micro mobility, and then you've got this, maybe public transport, and then the regional context. What's the key to kind of making that all work, do you think?
It's a very interesting question. I think part of the answer could be to begin to realize that at the metropolitan scale, which is the largest scale, you really need to integrate the different authorities that at the moment are very fragmented, thinking on their own silos of how to, for example, bring more buses to their specific routes or cover a specific area of the metropolitan region. And so at the bigger scale, at the larger scale, I think thinking in this metropolitan vision and integrate the systems could be the way to move forward and to make a more efficient overall system for urban mobility. At the micro scale, I think there has to be a change in perception that when you do an urban mobility micro project, yes, you're addressing the issue about how people move, what are the means the people have to move from one place to another. But also it's an economic case. If you provide more options to the people to move in different ways, what you're doing is you're providing that specific area of the city with alternatives to move, make it more accessible, and therefore, as an economic argument, you could say that that area of the city will be better connected. And I think at the moment there is this disconnection between the two concepts of why is not only to have a better public transportation or urban mobility strategy in a specific part of the city, it is also an economic case to make that part of the city more successful.
And we talked a little bit about yesterday, linking the planning aspects to mobility. Can you talk a little bit about linking place with mobility and some of the projects and things that we were talking about yesterday? Well,
there is this, I would not say it's an emerging trend, because in Europe or in North America, it has been on the debate, on the discussion of authorities and designers and urban planners for a few years now. But it's the relationship of how, if the place has options for better urban mobility or different alternatives to move around, you also address issues such as public health or such as I was saying, economic value of that particular area of the city. So people in the local government have started to realize that they are not only ticking the box in terms of public transportation aspects, but they're also addressing things that are more important or that are equally important to population, such as giving the option to have a better sidewalk to walk the last mile to their homes or to their jobs, and therefore improving aspects that are related to public health. Things like that, I think. Some of the projects that the office, since I came back to Mexico City, is trying to understand is how the data that is available from all these new emerging urban mobility services, such as the scooters or the public bike program, can give you some clues to understand how people move around the specific areas in the cities and how that movement is shaping the place in the city where they operate. So, for example, when you have a lot of people using scooters in specific boroughs in the city, such as the one you were yesterday and today, which is Condesa, it has created a series of problems and challenges, such as neighbors complaining about the lack of regulation to use that. But more people are sharing the street. So, for example, you could see that there are benefits because car drivers are more aware of not only cyclists, but scooters. And that has started to create an awareness that the street and the road is not only a place for cars, but for other means of transportation and mobility. And that you could argue, Zoe, that from where you come in Australia and in Europe, that is now the norm, but here it is a novelty, and it's something that is going to make the street a safer place.
I think it's not quite there in Australia yet, but some parts, but still very car.
Right.
And this is my road, and you cyclists get off my road. But they're trying to change that by having better access to services, so more people are cycling, so then, or infrastructure, so more people are cycling, so, you have that awareness of people on the street that are not cars, not one person driving in a vehicle. So I think it is shifting, but I think it's so complex, right? It's not just like A plus B equals C. It's so many different variables coming together with mobility that we can't just plonk down some new mode and then our problem can be solved, because that integration piece that you spoke about, okay, that's great that people can get around and you're creating a good place in that kind of micro space, but then making sure that we're not forgetting about connecting the regional people that are coming in every day. And
Right.
and that first, I guess, like the first and last mile to me is like people that live close to the public transport and nodes, but then that first however many kilometers it takes for somebody who can't afford to live in the city or lives in the region for whatever reason, how do we make sure that they can get into the city without 2 hours of commuting every day?
Right.
Or 4 hours, maybe 2 hours each way, and that kind of thing. So I think using the data and integration and integrating those different authorities together, so then we can get a better service for people that have a longer commute.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also the importance of understanding that data can also help you to plan future simple elements, such as the sidewalks, like, what makes a better and smart sidewalk in the future is not only has been discussed with functions such as areas for stormwater and sustainable aspects of ecology, but it could also be a sidewalk that could integrate different types of mobility depending on the flows and depending on the modes of transport and mobility that is used. So a sidewalk of 5 meters wide that can have a lane or a painted mark for scooters, pedestrians, and economic activity, it might be one solution to this conflict that at the moment exists between the users for that smaller sidewalk.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how unique it is, but often, like, Australia is very, regulated. The sidewalk is very regulated, so you can't just, pop up a store, where it's in Mexico.
Tables,
that just happens, and it's a nice experience when you're walking around. But if you don't have enough space, then you're taking up pedestrian space, and then you've got this conflict of pedestrians, scooters, cyclists, and these food trucks, I suppose.
Right.
If you know where those things are popping up, then you can plan those a bit better with the smart streets, which will have all of those things that we want, because that creates a place, but reducing some of that conflict, so then we don't have as much tension or anxiety between the different users.
Exactly. And for example, there was one conversation that I was having this morning about the parklets, because the parklets is a concept that emerged 5 years ago to reclaim some segment of the street that used to be for car parkings on the street, and transform it into some spaces for cafes or outdoor activities of some shops or restaurants. But now is also a question of, can a parklet not accommodate the scooters and the bike parking so that they don't interfere with the flow of pedestrians in the sidewalk? And the guy that I was talking about, he said, well, that's an interesting concept, because then you put a norm that is very, very specific about the space in the street, which is one car park space that used to be for a car to be parked in the street, now is a parklet for all the scooters to be parked when they are in that block, for example.
Yeah. And
that could help to unravel at the moment the conflict that have between the pedestrians and the people that use those smart mobilities that are, by the way, are mostly millennials that they tend to overrule every rule they have, right?
As a millennial, yes.
Right.
I'm a rule follower, though, so...
Well, but sometimes the rules are there to be
broken, right?
And
so, also, you don't know them a lot of the time. So I took a Lime the other night, and it's like the rules are follow the rules. And you're like, well, it doesn't tell you anything more, right? You're like, oh, okay, yes, I agree, but I don't know whether I'm supposed to be riding on the road, on the cycle lane, the footpath, whatever, because in Australia you have to ride on the footpath. You're not allowed to ride on the road, whereas here it's the opposite, right? Anyway, can we talk a little bit about linking mobility with sustainability and the urgent things that we need to be doing now to kind of transform our transport network into something that's a bit greener?
Right. Well, here, if I can focus on the issues with Mexico City, obviously the problem of congestion in the city has a direct implication on sustainability because of the air pollution and noise pollution. So the city has been working probably during the last 10 years on addressing how to reduce emissions that are coming from congestion. And the way they have addressed and tackled that problem primarily touches upon aspects related to norm and restrict the usage of vehicles, private vehicles that are more pollutant, but also on the public transportation, mostly taxi, fleet, and buses have started to shift to greener options or running on green fuels or
low emission
fuels, electric vehicles, and so on. So now you see a lot of taxis in Mexico City that receive a type of tax incentive and subsidy to purchase an electric car or a hybrid car as opposed to a standard petrol car. And the other is addressing by giving options to the citizens to move on those short trips by other means of transport that are not motorized. So mostly bike. Now recently the scooters. There are the motorbike service now emerging in Mexico City. So I think those are initiatives that both the private sector have understood that there is a business case to put the services in the city because there is a growing demand. I would say it's an organic growth. It's not something that is proven that is going to be increasing in the future, but the advantage of having apps tracking you live data on those users is that you know how many people are registering, and because people are registering at a higher pace, then you assume that the service will be on demand in the future. And then the other aspect is really that people start to understand that short trips, less than a mile, between a mile and 2 miles, can be done by these modes of transportation that are completely, or are more greener, or are completely
carbon neutral.
Exactly.
Like walking, for example, like making sure that we include walking in our smart mobility and mobility as a service or whatever platform it looks like, but making sure that walking is attractive as well. I don't know how it's going to work exactly, but there's a few things. You could give someone an incentive to walk rather than doing something else. You could make sure the infrastructure is a nice, way to walk. I mean, I found Mexico City and the places that I've been in very walkable, and I've really enjoyed walking around. And it's, I've been thinking about where I've felt like, oh, this is nice, and, I feel safe and everything. And then what are the characteristics of a place that I don't feel so safe, and kind of comparing those. And I think, it's a lot to do with other people walking, like lots of people around, lighting, retail, that even the small pop-up food trucks and stuff like that, because there's a vibe of just everyone having a good time or just going about their day. Whereas in the places where maybe the lighting's not so good, it's like a side street that no one really goes down, you go, oh, and not that anything like an immediate hazard or something, but you just go, oh, okay, hang on, I want to go back to Reformer where, that street where everyone's kind of moving around. And so really looking at how we can use data to map that out and make more of those places in a way that feels still organic, as, not forced or artificial, because I think, that's the charm of Mexico City, right? That there's so much different architecture and beautiful buildings, but really old stuff. And then even the newer stuff still has the same kind of charm and feel. So I think walkability has a lot to do with using technology, but not necessarily in the way we think it has to be, where it's an app or something like that, but tracking, where people are feeling safe, and then using the data to then prioritize where the infrastructure should be upgraded or
right.
Or
Because I think the data for us is useful for three things. The first one is understand where people do have choices and where people do not have choices.
Yeah.
So it's very different if someone has one option only to go from A to B, that if they have two or three options. That makes you feel very, very different on your daily experience.
Agreed.
And if data allows you to understand where they have less options or choices so that you can plan a solution to provide more options or choices, I think that is one way we're trying to use data. The second one is related to understand data and see if there is a pattern of, as you said, the way you feel when you move from A to B. So if there is data that can reveal the level of anxiety when you move by car or when you go by metro from A to B, that is quite interesting to understand the correlationships, because people do prefer to pick the mode of transport because the way they feel more comfortable, more safer, enjoy the trip better than the other alternative, right? Mm-hmm. And the third one has got to do with efficiency, pure and simple. Mm-hmm. How long it takes from take you to A to B by taxi or by metro or by your private car. In this city, unfortunately, the socioeconomic gap between the people with less disposable income, unfortunately, do not have choices. They have only one choice. Their feeling of using public transport, as I said before, is really disgusting. And lastly, it takes them 2.5 hours on a daily trip from A to B, when if they have a metro option, they could have 45 minutes of a different experience. So I think if you take data and try to find those emerging patterns to plan for the future better mobility or public transportation plans, that would be the way to go.
And I've also been thinking a lot about, and we talked about it a little bit yesterday, how linking with place, but linking with jobs. So where are the jobs and where's the affordable housing? It's not necessarily that people want to come into the city every day, in peak hour. It's just that that's where the job is. That's where the higher paying jobs are. And so they make the trip in. So it's not necessarily that there's an issue with moving around necessarily, but there's an issue with so many people wanting to go to the same place at the same time. So there's a few things you can do about that. You can increase the capacity, but increasing it in a way that's greener and more equitable is, through mass transit. It's not building more roads.
Right.
And then, but the other thing, and it's a combination, obviously, complex web of things, moving some of the jobs to where the people live or creating the jobs that people want in those areas. And you only can do that effectively using data and actually engagement with the people that you're actually trying to help as well. Not just this is a government program and here it is, and without any engagement from the people, because you'll never quite understand what it is they want. But I think also the baseline data as well, like what is it like now, and whatever the story is, you take it as that. And then we're going to do some kind of intervention, and then looking at the data again, I think that's really important, so then we can actually understand, not anecdotally understand.
Right. Yes. I think I mentioned it yesterday. I think having a baseline where to start analyzing the data is very, very important. And sometimes the non-existence of that baseline information creates the first question, right? So what are we going to be benchmarked against? Are we going to start benchmarking ourselves against nothing? Well, that is very pretty absurd, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes you're right. It's very important to have that baseline measured, so that then after that you can start analyzing the data and be more projective in the sense of what solution is needed. Yeah,
because you look at like a percentage of growth, for example. If you start at 0, you get an absurd number and it doesn't make any sense. So if you start, and we know it's never, 0, but it's always the existing there. You can never properly analyze the benefits and the impacts unless you have the starting line. But yeah, I think that's a really a key area, and something that maybe we're not talking about enough in this smart community space is things that you could do right now that aren't super sexy and it's passive. in the most part about getting that baseline sorted and not using old, survey data and that kind of thing, using accurate, real-time, effective data as well. Okay, that kind of leads on to this next part. We'll kind of wrap it up a little bit, but what are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
Emerging trends in urban mobility, you mean?
Yeah, let's talk about it.
There has been for a while this emerging trend about the AVs, the automatic vehicles, and I think it hasn't hit the road here in Mexico City yet. But there are a lot of startup companies that began with private fleets moving people back and forth from the central district to Santa Fe, which is a business district in the outskirts of Mexico City. And because of the very limited road access that area has and the difficulty in the topography to put public transport such as metro, a lot of the startups with private fleets have started to wonder what would it be to have AVs operating some of their services. And the questions remain to be asked on the first instance. As you said, what's the baseline to argue that might be a way to go? But it's definitely something that is catching the attention of entrepreneurs in this city. And the other emerging trend is I think the notion of walkability, but in a sense that it is not to cover the last segment of a trip, but it's really part of the overall system of urban mobility. So walkability is part of your system and how you plan it in the way and in the places that will make commutes, interchanges more efficient. And nobody has, I think, thought about it better than the system in Hong Kong. So, for example, in Hong Kong, the transport interchanges between the middle city and the lower city has those interesting escalators and elevators and ramps and all that. But it's part of the system. If you take that out, the interchange would not exist at all. And that is an emerging trend that now people are talking about in the domain about, well, would walkability should be part of the public transportation system, as it were.
I like that. Like making it enjoyable or an experience to walk between, say your metro bus and I don't know, whatever your other mode will be next.
Exactly. You have sometimes, and here in Mexico City, you could nowadays it's a nightmare because you have a lot of informal vendors, food stalls interrupting your path from when you go from one metro station to another one. But that is about probably half a mile, give or take. So that part of the trip is quite important. And at the moment it's just inaccessible and you don't really think as part of your system where you should think is part of your system.
Yeah, focus on that, and then you can, very small things could improve that astronomically, right?
Yeah, and it has been thought in internal spaces such as what you require to move a long walking distance, but it's not longer enough to take another mode of transport, such as the airports. In airports, you have the travelators, right, to move faster, 200 feet, 300 feet, 500 feet. And it's part of your system. If you don't have that, people won't maybe be able to get to their gates in the right time, right? So it's the same in the city. Why, it's something that we should be thinking probably. And the final one is the cable cars. And there's a big question because they went on a high with Medellin and many other examples of cable cars arguing it was a good choice. Then it went on a low because the business case was not very robust in some of those projects that were implemented. And now it's on high because first is green. You could argue it's carbon neutral or low emissions. Secondly, it appears to move people at the same rate that other means of transport. And thirdly, it gives you a different perspective of your place. So it could create a different feeling to an experience to your daily trip. So I know it's not an emerging trend, but I think people are starting to relook at the cable cars in a different way.
Excellent. It's been so great to chat with you. And thanks for hosting me in your office here.
My pleasure, Zoe. You're always welcome, even if it takes 2 hours to come here, which is only on the Fridays, I have to say.
Yes. And it was an experience. But if I had to do it every day, that's the thing. I think about what I accept now because I'm traveling, so you just accept what it is. But then you think about if I had to do this every day, what different choices you would make.
Oh, that's what I cycle every day from work to my home. I'm lucky enough to live close by, but it's cycling is much more efficient and makes my daily trip a better experience than jumping into a car or into an Uber.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Pablo. Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community or find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter @SmartComPod. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears, so thank you in advance. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.